This is one of the giant heads of the Olmec culture, located in the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. It's about 8 feet tall, made of basalt stone, and most of these were actually found buried within the last 100 years. So whether they were buried on purpose by a later culture than the Olmec, or whether they simply sank into the jungle at this point is unknown. But there are many, many of these. You see the carving, the pitting, and on the back are these curious depressions. Also these very famous little jade figures of the Olmec. You see some have obvious elongated heads. Also amongst the Olmec, there are obvious signs in the sculpture of cranial deformation or elongated heads, probably only amongst the royal class, which is what we also find in other cultures around the world that perform cranial deformation. It was only for the royalty. And then we find the actual examples of cranial deformation among the Olmec people. You can see that these are clearly cradle-boarded, or examples of cranial deformation. Nothing profound in terms of size of the skull, or even the shape. So what we've been able to see is cranial deformation was performed by at least 3 cultures in ancient Mexico: the Olmec, the Maya, and the latter one, whose name I didn't really account for, read properly. But it was only done, like anywhere else on the planet, cranial deformation was only done on the royal people, the priestly class, the chiefly class, to distinguish themselves from the commoners. And that's what we find, where we find cranial deformation on 6 of the 7 continents on this planet. And the most common timeline seems to be, for some reason, 2,000 years ago. I don't think there's a necessary connection with that. But also, the most profound elongated skulls on the planet clearly are the Paracas from the coast of Peru. This is the massive sculpture out of basalt stone. The figure is Tlaloc, which is the rain god. This little girl will give you an indication of the scale of it. You can see there's been a lot of damage. The weight of it, conservatively, I would think at least 60 tons. It was found outside Mexico City, lying flat on its back and abandoned for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and then was finally brought here to the Museum of Anthropology. Doubtful that it's from the Aztec period. It could be Toltec, which is older, or the Teotihuacan people. We're on the Altiplano outside of Mexico City. It's slightly higher than Mexico City itself. And the site we're at is called Tula. But Tula is a Spanish name. The original name in the Aztec language of Nahua is Tolan. And Tolan simply means city or the city. It's a site that's older than the Aztec. It goes back at least as far as what we call the Toltec civilization, which preceded the Aztecs. And this is where we find the very famous so-called Atlantean figures made of basalt stone.
That's okay. Booty there. There you go. Gotcha. See the crack.
So the local explanation as to what these represent are not Atlantean people. They're not aliens, but they're actually Toltec warriors. The headdress, you see snakeskin, and then you see feathers, so that's the symbol of Quetzalcoatl. And then these are thought to be arrows. And then this is said to be a crossbow, a little tiny crossbow whose mechanism is a rubber band, because native rubber is grown in the jungles of Mexico. And then the shield on the back, because he can't hold anything more than one thing in one hand at one time. And then in front, you have the butterfly shape, which is the chest plate that protects the warrior from being pierced in the heart with any kind of weapon, and it was made out of obsidian. So again, you see the snakeskin and the feathers representing a disciple of Quetzalcoatl. So of course you do have to make up your own mind, but which would you believe? The local story that they represent warriors holding a type of bow and arrow with a chest plate and then a shield behind, or what would appear to be more fanciful, which is that they are aliens or Atlanteans or something with laser beams. Personally, I go for the former, and I always listen to local knowledge. This is the famous Avenue of the Dead at Teotihuacan outside Mexico City. It was built supposedly by the Toltec civilization maybe 2,000 years ago, and the famous Aztecs passed by this area as they were looking for their new homeland, which is present-day Mexico City, what was called Tenochtitlan, which means the place or the land of prophecy, or the place or land of the prophets. So it's actually likely that this little pyramid, which was built in front of the temple of Quetzalcoatl, or the plumed serpent, was done so on purpose to hide or partially isolate the temple of Quetzalcoatl in behind, because it's likely that it, in fact, was the most sacred place at Teotihuacan and could possibly be the oldest. The construction technique used at the temple of Quetzalcoatl is very different than the later works that we see, these little pyramidal structures that you see there. Lots of mortar used in construction. So as you can see, this temple structure was built right in front of the actual temple of Quetzalcoatl that has all of this not only amazing carving, but also possibly evidence of megalithic works. So as you can see, the staircase was made of quite homogeneous material. It looks like it all came from the same quarry. There was no mortar used in that lower section of intact staircase. Then all the material above is very inferior. And again, it's likely that the stone-on-stone contact aspects were original. Something devastating happened to the structure. And then the Toltec rebuilt in the area, incorporating the ancient parts. And that's what we find in Peru, Bolivia, Egypt, Lebanon, any place where there's an ancient site where there are aspects of megalithic construction. Temple of the Sun, supposedly, behind us. And now we're approaching the Temple of the Moon here at Teotihuacan outside Mexico City. Built, supposedly, not by the Aztecs, but by their predecessors, who were called the Toltecs, even though we don't know what they called themselves. The Aztecs arrived later, found their constructions, and said, these people are artisans. And therefore, that's why they called them the Toltec. So what's interesting about the Temple of the Moon, aside from the fact that it's huge, it was a major engineering and architectural feat by the Toltec people, possibly 2,000 or more years ago, is you'll notice the difference in construction technique. You see those very nice cube-like blocks for the stairway. The stairway has, of course, been reconstructed, but they are very different than the form of construction of the pyramid itself, which is quite inferior, utilizing a lot of mortar. And the mortar they made is actually volcanic ash. And I believe they added lime to it to make it hard. And then we have the Temple of the Sun, which is much, much bigger. Massive scale, footprint, several acres. Another interesting aspect about Teotihuacan is that it seems to have been designed on purpose to have an acoustic quality to it. And that is why you have the proportions of these big, but especially these little pyramids. If you stand on this platform coming up here and clap your hands, there's an echo. And this was likely where the great orator would stand in order to make pronouncements to the people who could have been sitting on the staircases and the different levels of these mini pyramidal structures here at Teotihuacan. We're in the pyramidal structure called Cholula, or at Cholula in Mexico. It's the largest pyramidal structure in the world, footprint of 45 acres, whereas the Great Pyramid in Egypt has a footprint of 13 acres. It's not a true pyramid as such, but it's one of the largest earthworks on the planet. So the tunnel itself is not really ancient, but it was a way for archaeologists, likely in the 19th century, to be able to carve into the pyramidal structure and find the different levels, because it's like layers of an onion. Every layer you go into is an older pyramidal structure. The material is like volcanic ash, so it's really easy to carve and shape. In total, there's something like 8 kilometers or 5 miles of tunnels that they carved. Yeah.
Holy mackerel. Back into the light.
So this whole hill you're looking at is a human-made construction. Again, the footprint, 45 acres, whereas the Great Pyramid in Egypt is about 13 acres. So in terms of volume, it's the largest pyramidal structure on the planet. So again, this is the exterior, probably the last phase of construction, but there are other pyramidal structures inside of it. Over the course of extensive amount of time, one was built on top of the other, and then on top of the other.
Yeah, you can see photographs 100 times and really see it.
This is one of the famous Olmec ball player heads, about 3,000 years old. And Ed, who was our geologist, has just told us that the material it's made out of is volcanic tuff. It's not basalt. Volcanic tuff is not that hard a material, so it is quite conceivable that even with Bronze Age tools or stone tools, that these Olmec people could have shaped these enormous sculptures. We're going to see, though, if there are also basalt ones, basalt being a much harder stone. So here we are in the Jalapa Museum, and we'll see what else we can find. So the Olmec are still a big mystery. They are one of the oldest, if not the oldest, cultures in what we call Mexico, dating back at least 3,000 years. We're an older culture than the Maya, the Toltec, the Teotihuacan, and the Aztec. And Olmec simply means the rubber people, and that was an archaeological name given to them because no one knows what they called themselves. We're in the Jalapa Museum on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and this museum is phenomenal. It's a huge collection of Olmec and other culture, art, stone. The huge Olmec heads are here, undercover, being protected. This is a state-of-the-art museum, as fine as any you would find on the planet. And, interestingly, we also find examples of cranial deformation and elongated heads. So this is the Zapotal culture. You can see the flattening of the top of the head here. Then somewhat like we see on the coast of Peru, somewhat like the Paracas, but the Paracas more extreme. And then an even greater example, again, similar to what we call the cone heads of Paracas in Peru. So here we have the Veracruz culture, the center of, or central area of Veracruz, from 600 to 900 AD. And this extremely altered human skull, with 3 suture lines instead of the normal 2. So from the same island, or same area, but on an island called the Island of Idols, here we have what a normal human skull looks like. There you have the one suture and another suture there. That's what every normal human skull looks like. But then we have this one. You can see it has an extra suture going from this suture forward. And you can see the shape is clearly altered. And here again from the Island of Idols, 900 to 900 AD to about 1521 AD. And it is missing the sagittal suture that should be running this way. And another one from the Island of Idols, again lacking the sagittal suture. Another point about the giant heads is that most archaeologists or people in general think that the noses are flat, but in the fact, or in many cases, the reasoning is because of the shape of the stone itself. You see, as I come down, the sculptor possibly couldn't project the nose out too far because of the nature of the stone. Maybe this here was the flat surface of the stone, because other sculptures of the Olmec depicting their faces show almost typical noses of most other cultures, not flat.
Oh, sí, 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 sí. Como the fairies. Yes, he was a spirit, right?
But it's a circle of fire.
When was this?
Es una bola de fuego.
¿Hace cuánto, José?
In the year 1996, 1996.
6 balls of firelight
6 balls of fire here in this pyramid.
landed on this pyramid.
En esta pirámide.
In this pyramid, up this pyramid, the people is scared. The people
Run away?
run away, allowed, no return to house. Together, every people asking him, what's happened with the pyramid? What's happened with that ball game? Where it came from? I don't know. It's fantastic. But that pyramid had a power. Somebody tell that.
Here we have quadcopter footage of the site of Venta, which is an ancient Olmec site. And my quadcopter, called Pachacutec, is now approaching an artificial hill created by the Olmec people. Now, it doesn't look like much, but the intriguing thing was that when I first started to fly over this hill, I lost contact with the quadcopter, as if there was some kind of energetic something going on this hill. And that was actually confirmed by our guide in the previous clip with the red hat. Now, the only really interesting things aside from the energetic component here are the Olmec heads and other stoneworks. It's not really that intriguing a site. I wouldn't go out of my way to visit it again, but it's an interesting place to see at least once in your life, because the surrounding area as well is quite intriguing. There's a lot of jungle in the area, unfortunately a lot of urban areas too. And this is one of the interesting Olmec heads, one of several that are on location. Unfortunately, these are concrete copies because the originals are in museums. But all in all, quite an intriguing site. These copies are exact duplicates, great detail. And again, you can see the energetic hill is in the background. Hugh Newman's quadcopter as well had major problems initially. So, as Hugh Newman was explaining, during the initial archaeological work being done here at Comalcalco, supposedly a number of baked clay bricks used in the construction, especially of probably the pyramid we're coming up to, showed different forms of writing. Mayan, obviously, because this is a Maya site, but also supposedly Old World, as in, as he previously discussed, Egyptian, maybe even Chinese, Phoenician, etc. But the museum had no examples. So you have to conclude either that the story is a fabrication, or that these examples of writing which don't fit the normal Mesoamerican history have been hidden away on purpose. And what we've seen is that the Olmec, there are no really sophisticated constructions at all. The piles of dirt and things like that. Of course, the big stone heads, but no construction of any sophistication whatsoever as compared to this, which is more of the classic Maya work. So this could be evidence of one of the ancient ball courts with howler monkeys in the background. And it's believed that the Olmec may have invented the ball court process, but it was perfected by the Maya later. So what I've been looking for is evidence of the arrival of what is called the plumed serpent, known to the Maya as Kukulkan, and to the Aztec and possibly the Teotihuacan culture as Quetzalcoatl. And he is said to have been a light-skinned man with a full beard who came as a teacher from a distant land. Amongst the Olmec, there's almost zero evidence of his existence, but once you get into the Maya and the Teotihuacan and the Aztec, there's substantial evidence, because you see these figures with full beards, which Native Americans in general can't grow to this very day. So that possibly could give us a date as to his arrival, maybe around, literally around the time of Christ, but I'm definitely not saying that it was Christ. But that sort of timeline, 100 BC to 100 AD. So we have two forms of building technology here, predominantly the work of the Maya, and that's stucco and also baked clay bricks. No stone whatsoever, because there is no stone in this area. So that is one thing that makes this this complex kind of interesting, in that it's different to other sites where we see a lot of volcanic stone incorporated, but since there's none in the area, of course, they're going to use what they have, and that's clay and volcanic ash mixed with lime to make a primitive kind of concrete. So we are looking at the plausibility that there was a great light-skinned teacher or teachers who had a full beard around the time of 100 BC to 100 AD. He or they would have first appeared in what we call Peru, and would have taught what would become the Inca, because the Inca more or less formulated during that time. Their knowledge level was way beyond anybody in the area. And then he or they traveled to the coast at the border of Peru and Ecuador, sailed to the northwest, and wound up where we are in this part of Mesoamerica, the Gulf Coast area of Mexico. And there, to the Maya, he became known as Kukulkan, and then he traveled onwards northwest into what is now called Mexico City, and there he became Quetzalcoatl, or they. We're at Palenque, which is on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Steamy jungle area. This is one of the great Mayan cities. Lord Pakal, who was the most famous ruler, was entombed inside this pyramid. In fact, there's a staircase from the top, which is now closed. 2 levels down, staircase down that way, turning 180 degrees, and then that way. And that's where his limestone sarcophagus lined in cinnabar, which is a mercury oxide, is located. And then his body was found, of course, inside this massive limestone box. No evidence so far of any lost ancient high technology at use here. It's standard Mayan construction of stone and mortar, but spectacular sight. The beauty is that it's built on top of a hill, and that's intact rainforest in behind. And this could be the first sign of megalithic elements, as in that staircase. So you see, here's the standard technology of the Maya. But then when we get to this staircase, it's quite curious. These blocks might have originally fitted together very well. So if you only have one example of possible megalithic elements, like we just saw, then that could be coincidence. But what about when it starts repeating, like here, in that staircase? So if you have one example of possible more advanced stoneworking at a site, then that could be coincidence. But now we're seeing more. We're seeing a difference in these two staircases that are right next to each other. Have a look. So again, standard Mayan construction, and in the staircase, but when we turn left, all of a sudden we have bigger blocks that look like they could have originally been precisely cut and then were reassembled as you see them now. So what you're hearing in the background is the sound of howler monkeys living in the tree canopy here. Same phenomenon you see at Tikal in Guatemala, another huge Mayan site. So another area where we could have megalithic elements, because once again you have relatively small stone, roughly cut, bonded together with some kind of lime or clay or other material, and then contrasted with what you're about to see. So the standard form of construction, and then this. Now we have example number 5 of something which doesn't fit the normal construction pattern. Above you have small stones. Below you have much bigger stones. Some of them still fitting together reasonably well, but it looks obviously like the lower section has been destroyed or damaged and then possibly reconstructed. But you definitely see, once again, someone put a lot of effort into cutting these bigger blocks as compared to the one would presume would be later construction out of much smaller things. Also, the two buildings that seem to have the larger stones in their construction are in the core of Palenque, and that's common. As in Machu Picchu, what we find is the core is megalithic. It's the oldest part, and then the 90% that was built afterwards by the Inca spreads out from the core. And here too, the core so far has 5 examples of larger than normal stone construction. Everything else is the smaller type, and here's a final look. So that's the kind of stuff you really want to find. If you see a consistent building style, or you see a gradual increase in efficiency and quality of a building style, then you can say, well, the foundation is primitive and was made by these people, and then either their descendants or others who moved in or other influences allowed for increased quality. When you find big slabs like that in the two core buildings of a place, really badly damaged, as if something cataclysmic maybe had happened to them, and then you have inferior work above, then that does suggest that you're looking quite possibly at 2 completely different cultures. The one doing the large slab work being clearly superior to the one that did the regular, somewhat rough stone and mortar work. There are now more than 800 of my videos at Hidden Inca Videos on YouTube, or sorry, Brien Foerster on YouTube, or www.hiddeninCatours.com, or www.hiddenhumanhistory.com. And what we try to do is analyze these magical and also somewhat enigmatic places and see if standard archaeology stands up 100% to what we're looking at, or if they've missed certain aspects. And when it comes to the engineering and stone masonry aspects, quite often they miss critical stuff that could make these sites far more older, and some aspects of the construction having been made by cultures that they have no idea, don't recognize, and have no clue as to who they were or when they were here. This is the Temple of the Moon at Teotihuacan. Notice how the staircase construction is completely different from the rest of the structure. And then at the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, notice the large blocks that appear to have originally been in place, but now are damaged and on the ground. And then we have the massive Pyramid of the Sun. Again, notice the staircase is different in construction than the rest of the building. And as we approach the Pyramid of the Sun, we see that the staircase is made of cut, cube-like blocks, where the rest of the building is made of simple volcanic stone. And here we see the Pyramid of the Sun from the Pyramid of the Moon, massive in scale. And again, as we go backwards, we see the immensity of the Pyramid of the Sun amongst these smaller temple structures. Now at the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, again, the staircase is made of cut blocks. And yet the rest of the construction is really quite simplistic, except for those large cut stones there. This is a typical staircase located at Teotihuacan of mixed material. And one very large stone here that clearly was originally used in the construction but now isn't. And now we are approaching the Temple of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Moon, and this gives you a look at most of the entire work located at Teotihuacan, about 2 hours outside of Mexico City. This is a standard staircase, very crudely made. And here in behind, again, the fine cut blocks of the staircase at the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. Compare it to the other rather crude construction that is around it. And again, here we focus in on the staircase at the Pyramid of the Sun. Cut cube-like blocks. And looking down, we're going to see the typical kind of staircase, lots of mortar and crudely put together. We are now at Tula, which also is about 2 hours away from Mexico City, but in a completely different direction. This is where we find the so-called Atlantean statues, which was a term made up by a 19th century British or American writer. We'll actually see that these statues have nothing to do with Atlantis. That was just a fancy term used and now, unfortunately, has stuck. Again, we can see that cube-like stones seem to have been recycled in parts of the staircase. And now we approach the structures or statues themselves, made of very hard basalt stone, which is not found locally. You see that each one of these statues is made up of at least 4 different sections. They were found by archaeologists having fallen down, likely the result of the Spanish invaders. And these are called the Atlantean warriors. Indeed, they were warriors, but they were warriors of Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. again, having nothing to do with Atlantis, and then this curious object carried in the right hand. Now, some people have claimed that it's some kind of laser weapon. In fact, it was likely a very early, small type of crossbow. And here we have detail of the figures themselves. Notice the headdress is a mixture of feathers and serpent scales. So that's the plumed serpent. And then here we get a close-up of a relief carving of one of the warriors, likely of the Toltec civilization. As the sun goes down, we get our last glimpse of Tula. Notice these protruding knob-like things. These stones look like they lock together, one on top of another, on top of another. And in the left hand, the warrior is carrying a bundle of small arrows to go with the little crossbow. That is local oral tradition. So we'll be going back to Mexico in February 2019. Thank you. Hi, this is Brien Foerster of HiddenIncaTours.com, and today we are exploring Palenque in Mexico. Palenque was one of the great Mayan constructions located in the jungle in the eastern part of Mexico. And this actually is where Lord Pakal, the most famous Maya of the area, was buried. But what we're looking for today are examples of lost ancient high technology. You can see here that this staircase is quite crude in construction, with a lot of mortar made from volcanic ash. And this is a typical Mayan type of construction. You see relatively small stones, a lot of clay mortar, and then also stucco put on the outside in order to be able to hide the workmanship below. This is an example of a wall that still has the mortar on it and the strange T-shaped depression in the stone work. But now look at those stones in front. Those are massive in size. Again, you see the relatively rough construction work here, and then big slabs in the background at the bottom there. And here, large stone blocks on the right side that have been put back together. They were probably much tighter fitting in the past, and then much rougher work on the left-hand side. How can these be from the same time period? And now here, we're walking through part of this very large complex. And again, look at the stones that make up the staircase. They're very large, relatively, and very tight-fitting. And again, walking through the complex, you see quite rough work, some modern repair, and then these big blocks that make up this staircase. It's all limestone material, quite likely local, but why would you have such big blocks incorporated in a staircase like that when all of the rest of the work is relatively crude? And here, we're going to another staircase almost right next door, and notice that it is made of smaller stones with lots of mortar? Why two types of constructions in the same location? And again, quite massive stones making up this staircase, with some likely later, cruder repair work. Here, rough work again. And this gives you simply an overview of what the jungle of Palenque looks like and the very organic nature of the construction of this ancient Maya location. There are also tunnel systems like this. This is actually where the people slept. These were the bedrooms because the jungle area is quite hot and it's always nice and cool inside here. And as we continue through the tunnels, with way too many tourists for my liking, here we see a large slab of stone. And then walking through more of the complex, you see in general relatively small stonework, but beautiful looking edifices. And here, a small temple of some kind, and a relatively rough altar. Now we explore deeper into the jungle part of Palenque. Only 10% of it has been excavated, so that means the majority of it is still overgrown with jungle foliation. And going up a staircase, again, which is relatively crude in construction. We get to this large composition of stone, and this is a frieze or a relief carving of a Mayan noble of some kind, supposedly about to be eaten by a crocodile or alligator. Then descending back out of the jungle and into the main complex again. This actually is the core part of Palenque, where those large stone slabs were that made up the staircases. And here again, some very large slabs of limestone that don't match with the composition of the rest of the building. Notice that they fit tightly relatively compared to the rough work in the background, and some of them are damaged with large cracks in them and are even broken. Again, the rougher Mayan work, and then the large interlocking slabs of stone. I theorize that these large slabs are from a much older time period and that Palenque was found by the Mayan as an abandoned, somewhat megalithic site. And next door to where that building was, again, rough construction on the right, and then these very large slabs of stone that no longer fit together, almost stacked up as if they're simply a pile of what once used to be a very tight-fitting, relatively large structure. And now we're starting to exit Palenque, which is quite a massive site. Again, the farther we get from the core, the rougher the work we see. That's generally what we find at megalithic sites. The core tends to be megalithic and the oldest part, and then the farther out you go from the core, the rougher work we see made by the culture, in this case the Maya, or in the case of Cusco, the Inca, or in the case of Egypt, the dynastic Egyptians. Palenque is a beautiful location, well worth visiting if you're in Mexico. And we make one trip there per year. In 2018, it was in January where I took this film footage. And in 2019, it will be in February. This video is a series of videos of material that I shot during the January 2018 tour, and from it will be multiple videos about signs of lost ancient high technology. So please consider joining us in Mexico, February 2019 at hiddenincatours.com. It's another edition of hiddenincatours.com. This is the somewhat famous site of Uxmal in the Yucatan, and this is called the Pyramid of the Magicians. Now, as you see, the staircase appears to be quite finely done of cube-like blocks, but then the interior of the pyramidal structure is very rough. You can see it's massive in scale, but its construction is basically rough stone and concrete. And as we go along the side of it, again you see its immenseness, but it's not that well done. But now we're going to focus on the back side. And here you can see some larger cube-like blocks that look like they've been reassembled. And here again you see on the left reasonably large cube-like blocks, and then rough to the right. And then here, in terms of construction, again, the lower area is much finer than the upper area. So this leads me to believe that Uxmal was built in two different time periods, the rougher work by the Maya on the right and reconstruction efforts by them on the left. Here again we see some large blocks there stacked on top of each other, and here reassembly. But then if you look at the upper area, it's much rougher than the first level. And here again, reassembly of blocks that look like they had to have been cut by some kind of saw, while the Maya only had obsidian tools. So it is quite likely that they discovered a much older site and then simply rebuilt it and then did their construction work on top and to the side. As we walk up this staircase, again, you can see some reasonably large stones that appear to have been reassembled in place. And here again, you see the staircase at the back is quite well done, but the work on the side is quite crude. And another example of this, where you have reasonably fine stone construction work on the bottom, and then the second level is much rougher. So, like in Peru and Bolivia and Egypt and other locations, I'm seeing evidence that there was a much more ancient site than the Maya, but the Maya found it in disrepair and then rebuilt it. And this wall here is a classic example of that. Look at the cube-shaped blocks compared to the rough fill on the surface. And here, another example of that. Large stones mixed with basically just rough rocks. And finally, the back side, or actually left side of the pyramid. And again, we see this fine construction mixed in with very rough work. So I hope you'll consider joining us in Mexico, February 2019. Welcome once again to hiddenincatours.com, and today we're exploring Mitla in Oaxaca. Now, Mitla is not a site that is very commonly visited, but there are lots of anomalies here. Notice the size of these massive blocks on top of the wall as compared to the relatively crude work elsewhere. So this clearly seems to be a site that was found by the local native people and then rebuilt. Again, as we walk through this passageway, you see the very crude walls created by the local native people. And then in contrast, you see the size of this 6-ton block, which is a lintel. And here we're exploring more of it. And as time goes on, you'll see the difference again in construction style. Massive basalt blocks as headers, sometimes down at the foundation, and then very rough work in between. Here again, you see the large blocks on top and the relatively crude work below. It looks like it has been reassembled and could have been the victim of an ancient cataclysm thousands of years before the time of the local native people, who were called the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs. There are also present a number of these columns made of solid basalt. They are between 8 and 10 feet high, and the quarry from which the basalt comes from is at least 2 miles away. There are no native trees that grow in the area to be used as log rollers, so how were they moved? And then another giant lintel you'll see, solid basalt, and then much cruder work which came later. Look at the amount of mortar utilized and the very rough shapes of the stones. And here again, we see possible reassembly in the upper area and very crude work below. Now this is the kind of evidence we see definitely in Peru, Bolivia, Egypt, and Lebanon, but I was quite surprised to find it in Mexico. And here again, this shows you one of the large courtyard, a large pillar in the background, a giant stone there on the lower left, and then much cruder work in the rest of the area. And here, a large block that looks like it had to have been cut by advanced tools, inserted into a rough wall. And here are more of these massive basalt columns, and then there's a lintel to the right-hand side, one of the stones weighing at least 18 tons. And here, with the foundation, again you notice very large, super tight-fitting blocks. You can barely pass a piece of paper in the joints, if at all. And here, another very rough wall, and a massive lintel, and more of the giant columns. Sorry about the sound of the dog. And here again, look at the base. Very tight-fitting blocks and very rough work above it. Clearly done by two very different cultures. The work above by a relatively technologically primitive people, the work below by some advanced civilization living in Oaxaca, Mexico. And here, the church, which is next door, you can tell that the church was built using stone that had already been cut and was found locally. And again, a very rough wall, and then a lintel weighing at least 6 tons. And on the other end of the archaeological site, another giant column. And finally, another look at these tall columns and the lintel comprised of huge cut stones.